debut novel will be coming out December 1st of this year. I wanted it to debut here, but didn't quite make it. It'll be coming out from Aqueduct Press, and tell you a little bit about it. The name of the book is ELYSIUM, and it's told in a spiral narrative. I don't know if you know what that means, but it means it's the same story kind of told over and over and over again. And what I'm going to read for you now is part of one of the spirals. So here we go. Make sure I got my light here. Adrian stared up at what others either ignored or didn't notice, a tiny green dot. In her time of captivity, she had seen it hovering in the air many times. It never moved. It never altered shape or size. It remained constantly in place, rain or shine. This anomaly was only one of the many strange things about her surroundings. 3 moons rose, one after the other, to crisscross the night sky. The prison camp where they lived was gateless in a field of rock and dry red dirt. There was nothing around for miles and miles. It was a land of nothing, or so it seemed. Antoine lumbered over and put his large hand on her shoulder. She touched it and looked up into his round, watery eyes. He had never been the same since he had been wounded in the head in the fighting. It could have happened to anyone, but it had happened to him. Her brother, who was always the one who knew what to do, now had a mind like a child. "I'm hungry," he said. "Then let's get something to eat." They took their place in line to receive their meager food ration, a watery stew with chunks of God knows what in it. A bowl had enough nutrition to keep them from starving, but not much more than that. Antoine held his bowl with his head bent. Adrian patted him on the tummy, reminding him that he would have food soon. He smiled a crooked smile, then laughed. The Prestige, the Roaches, assigned one of her own people to pour out the stew. Tommy, a kid Adrian knew from back home. She'd watched him grow up, and growing up wasn't easy back home, where every day was a fight to survive. The Prestige's flickering, shadowy bodies were everywhere on Earth now, squeezing all human life out of existence. The morning after they arrived at the camp, they were marched, linked in chains, into the cold, miserable yard. The Roaches pulled Tommy out of line, grunted in his face, and practically tossed him across the yard. Adrian thought they were going to kill him. By instinct, she flipped one of the guards and headed for another before they knocked her down. When she came to, Antoine was bent over her, brushing her cheeks, shedding tears like a baby. Then she saw that they had handed Tommy a ladle and stood him before a hot cauldron of stew. Over and over again, she told Antoine that she was all right. She had to stand straight to make him stop crying. Her whole body was a giant bruise. But she smiled, so he smiled. It was funny to think that her stupid stunt was something that Antoine would have done if he had been in his right mind. That's what he always used to do, rush in without thinking. Now that was how he got hurt, and it was her who used to pick him up and worry. Large rocks were scattered about the red ground. They used them as seats. The rocks were not quite comfortable to sit on, but they were better than the ground. Adrian found a rock and sat with Antoine not far behind, willing to sit on the dirt. They huddled together as best they could during the meal times and talked in hushed tones, trying not to attract the attention of their captors. The stew smelled especially bad today. It slimed and plopped in her metal bowl. The chunks moved as if they weren't quite dead. Adrian closed her eyes and ate. There were no utensils, so she ate with her hands, which were dirty since water was in short supply. At least the stew warmed her fingers. Hey, Antoine, Jolly whispered. "Hey, Jolly." "Shh, not so loud," Adrian said. Antoine put his index finger to his lips, which was formed a little O, then whispered, "Hey, Jolly." Jolly patted Antoine on the back and leaned over to whisper in Adrian's ear. "Some of the guys slipped out last night." "What?" she whispered back. "Damn, I told everyone to sit tight." No one seemed to notice yet. "Keep me posted, Jolly." "Will do," Jolly said. They all ate with their fingers. The stew was so watery, it was more like a drink anyway. Antoine was playing with the chunk from his stew, and it wiggled in his fingers. Adrian told him to stop messing with it and to just eat. Her stomach soured when he popped the thing in his mouth. Jolly tapped Adrian to get her attention. "Look what's coming for dinner." She looked to where his head was pointed and saw that everyone else saw, a new prisoner being escorted through the gate. "What the hell?" Adrian said under her breath. The roaches were escorting one of their own into the compound, pulling it along in chains. The Prestige were four-dimensional creatures. To human eyes, part of them seemed to disappear into shadow as they moved. But the new one was different. It was more solid than the others. Its planar shifts, more defined and less shadowy, emitted pale, weak colors, and looked sick or beaten or both. They threw it to the ground, nearly missing a bunch of rocks that could have split its head open. "Nice," Jolly winced. "Yeah," Adrian said. The Prestige prisoner struggled to stand up. Nobody moved to help. They watched it stumble to its feet. It seemed dazed. When it was fully erect, it stared over at her people. Adrian could almost make out the thing's expression. Some of the humans turned their backs. The Prestige guards walked away. It looked around, then climbed onto a group of rocks and sat down. "What do you suppose that's all about?" Jolly asked Adrian. "I have no idea." A freezing wind blew, causing knuckles to crack and faces to peel. They made gloves out of thin cloth of their blankets. Wearing them didn't give them much warmth. The cloth seemed to protect their skin a little, though. They cut the tips of the gloves so that their fingers could handle things easier and took them off when it was time to eat. It had become a habit to put her numb fingers in her mouth, to breathe heavily on them. Her hands were filthy. It didn't matter. They were the only fingers she had. Antoine rocked himself and played with his nose. Adrian moved his hand away from his face and wiped his fingers with her shirt. A deep scar snaked across his forehead, the result of the accident that had crippled his mind. She caressed his scar, then took him into her arms and held him close. He needed her to baby him like a child, and this she would do until her dying day. Dear, sweet, sweet Antoine. "So what's the news?" Adrian whispered to Jolly. "No news is good news. The guys are still AOL." "No sign of him, huh?" He said something. She wished they'd listened to her and waited. Adrian wanted to make a real break out of this hellhole, taking the rest of her people with her, but she needed time to figure out where to go. There were those who escaped and were never found. She couldn't figure out where they had gone. The escape guys must have figured out something, she thought. Adrian did her morning check. Around them, there was only a flat horizon and a desolate, heavy sky, and there it was, the green dot. Same place, same size, same everything. "Look at that thing over there," Jolly said. For a moment, Adrian thought Jolly was talking about the green dot, but his eyes were focused on the other side of the camp, where the Prestige prisoner sat on a rock. It was bent over, bluish where it should be purple, and shaking like it had a fever. "Why doesn't it get something to eat from the pot?" Stephen said. It looks sick," Tommy said. "Serves it right," Jolly said. "Maybe it's too sick to get up," Tommy said. "Maybe we should get him something to eat or something," Stephen said. "What are you, nuts?" Jolly said. "I'm gonna lift my dick to piss on it." Jolly was a great fighter. He followed orders without question, and if Adrian told him to, he'd run straight into hell. But sometimes he made her feel crazy with his stupid talk. She stood up, went to the pot, and scooped some of the so-called stew into a metal bowl and walked over to the Prestige. Antoine lumbered behind her, looking away from the creature and rubbing his nose. "You want something to eat?" Adrian said, and waved the bowl in front of the Prestige to get its attention. It looked up. There was something in the way it stared at her that made Adrian think of her cat back home. It was as if the creature understood you better than you realized and was surprised and grateful at the unexpected kindness from a lower being. It took the bowl and nodded. It scooped some of the stew with its fingers and chewed slowly. It didn't seem to like the stuff either, but it ate. Adrian watched it for a bit, and then she and Antoine returned to their own kind. She looked back and saw the Prestige was still eating while it stared off into space. The three moons sat heavy and low in the dim morning sky. They had aligned themselves into an isosceles triangle. Each was a different color, orange, yellow, and the highest in the sky, a deep purple. The Prestige forced everyone out of their beds into the open air of the camp. The humans and the one Prestige prisoner were lined up face to face the moon and made to bow, while the guards hummed what Adrian figured was their prayers. Adrian ventured to look around, her eyes locked onto the Prestige prisoner. The thing seemed to be smiling at her. With the humming over, the guards replenished the pot of stew. Maybe it was some kind of religious sacrament for the Prestige to feed them. Whatever the reason, Adrian was glad for the additional food. The last few days, the men had been scraping at the bottom, eking out what they could. It was slop, but it did fill the belly. The men lined up to get their share of the muck from the cauldron. The Prestige prisoner joined them. "I don't like this thing near me," Jolly said under his breath. "Take it easy, Jolly," Adrian said, and maneuvered herself to stand next to the Prestige. It's just as much a guest here as you and I." "Shit," Jolly said. "How could he stand the smell?" "Jolly, shut it." Jolly frowned, but did what he was told. Antoine laughed and rubbed at his nose. Adrian tapped him on the stomach to make him stop. "Feeling better, I see," Adrian said to the Prestige. It made a small grunt and held out its bowl. Adrian couldn't tell if it was a friendly rave or a brush off. It received its portion of stew and retreated slowly to its rock on the other side of the yard. "What do you suppose is the deal with him?" Stephen said. "I mean, what's he doing here?" "Good question," Adrian said. A portion of the slop was poured into her bowl, and she tugged at Antoine's arm to tell him to follow. They walked towards the alien and sat on the ground before it. The Prestige stared at them and gently nodded as Adrian scooped some of the food into her bowl with her fingers. "Human," the Prestige said. Adrian looked up. "You speak English?" "I speak many languages," it said. "How many you speak?" Antoine laughed. "You got me there. I usually have a translator in my ear," Adrian said, looking around. "But around here, no such luxuries." "Yes, luxuries here are rare." She studied it, looking for where the sound was coming from. All she could see were moving shadows flowing around it. Her eyes could not fix on its shifts through the 4 dimensions. "So what the hell are you doing in this piss hole?" The Prestige moved its shoulders up and down as if it had the shivers. It took a moment for Adrian to realize that it was laughing. She smiled and Antoine laughed. "Human, you have a way with your language," it said, "and you are quite, how do you say, astute." It shook for a few more moments, then answered, "I make mistake. You make mistake. You pay for mistake. So I am here." "What kind of mistake, if I may ask?" Adrian said. "I am an academic, a researcher. I ask uncomfortable questions on treatment of humans." "You consider that a mistake?" "Perhaps I should ask questions with more delicacy." Adrian considered the Prestige for a moment. The more she stared at it, the more its planar shifts moved. She could see the thing for what it was behind the shadows of shifting form. It was a creature trying to survive, just as she and her people were. The Prestige stopped eating and said, "Perhaps I should be asking that of you." He pointed his long finger. "Why are you here?" Why do you think?" Adrian said, and shoved more food into her mouth. Some of the stew escaped onto her chin, and she used her arm to wipe it away. "It is not an answer to the question." "We're flyers," Adrian used her hand to show the swooping and sailing of flight, opening her fingers wide like feathers. "And I killed a lot of your people." "Of this you are proud?" Adrian put down her bowl. "Yeah, quite proud. If you hadn't attacked us in the first place." The Prestige held up a 4-fingered hand. "You say attack. Our history says attempt at contact. We defend ourselves." "That's bull, and you're a bunch of butchers and liars. If you find a nice blue planet, only one problem. There are already people living on it, so you decide to dust us out like vermin. And that's what you call us, right? Vermin." "I am aware of a particular name for us you call Roaches. That's what you are, roaches, crawling into places where you don't belong. Adrian stood up, and Antoine began to cry. She tapped him to make him stop. Did you expect us to just let you move in? To leave our home without a fight? Yeah, I fought you, and I'll continue to fight you with everything I got. Antoine's face was scrunched up like he had eaten a lemon. He held back his tears. Adrian took his hand and walked back to the others. She turned around to see the Prestige was quietly continuing its meal as if it had already been thinking about other things. At night, the air was still. Nothing moved. The only sound was the heavy breathing of the sleeping Prestige. Adrian turned over in her bunk to where it was cool and touched her harsh pillow. She thought of Helen and the smell of her hair and the lotion that she put on her face at night that smelled of 2 sweet flowers. Sometimes Adrian liked to touch her when she slept, just to feel her warmth and the rhythm of her pulse. Adrian wanted to get back to her. If only Adrian knew that she was all right, that Earth was all right. She could bear this place. Adrian, you awake? Antoine whispered. Yeah, I'm awake, Adrian whispered back. How can anyone sleep over that racket? The snores of the Prestige rose and fell like a rolling sea. I've been thinking about home, Antoine said. Yeah, me too. You suppose they're okay? I don't know, her voice trailed away. Helen had never liked Antoine, and now that he was injured, Adrian supposed that she would like him even less. There was something irreconcilable between them. It was why Adrian left with Antoine to go fight, leaving Helen behind. Truth be told, even without the war, there was probably not a home to go back to. It didn't matter though. Adrian still dreamed of Helen. Try to get some sleep, Tuan, she said. Stephen stumbled to Adrian's bunk and shook her urgently, whispering, they caught the guys. What? Are you sure? They're bringing them in now. Adrian and 8 others rushed to the window. The 4 who had escaped were being marched into the yard. One of the 4 was Kim. Adrian considered him a good friend. He was only a kid. For a moment their gazes met. Adrian imperceptibly lifted her chin so that watching eyes wouldn't notice. Kim understood the gesture's meaning and nodded in return. They were led to one of the empty barracks to await judgment. What do you think they're gonna do to him? Antoine whispered, his voice shaking. I don't know, Adrian said. I think they kill prisoners who try to escape, Stephen said. They won't, said the prisoner who didn't talk too much. They can't. Can they? I don't know if they would do that, Adrian said. It's possible, Stephen said. We don't know their rules of war. The simple truth was finally stated, their position finally uttered. There was no freedom. Their lives were completely at the mercy of these people who weren't people. Their prison, their rules. Any sense that they had any control over their situation was an illusion. They belonged to the Prestige and their lives were subject to their whims. Someone tried to escape, someone had to pay, someone had to be sacrificed. Antoine cried. 2 days later, in the middle of the night, Adrian and the others were led into the yard. 9 prisoners stood at attention to watch. 2 were more than friends. One had curly red hair that was slowly turning auburn, and one was Stephen, the brave. One was the Prestige. One had gray eyes who didn't speak too much. One was a direct descendant from Dion Mater. The last were Adrian and Antoine. They were a vigil in rags. The drizzle steadily soaked through what was left of their clothing, the rain commingling with the wetness already on their faces. In the darkness, lit only by the powered torches, the prisoners were made to form a semicircle around 4 posts set in the middle of the yard. The wood looked new, as if recently cut. No one spoke. Adrian couldn't swallow as they watched the guys who had escaped hauled into the muddy open yard, handcuffed, wearing nothing but filthy underwear, exposing all their shame. They shivered from the cold and the fear. Antoine clasped Adrian's hand. It was a high offense to try to escape. There was only one other thing a prisoner could do that was worse, and that was to kill a Prestige guard. Adrian did her best not to seem scared for the sake of Antoine, though if it were possible to run, she would. In her mind, she was already running and running and running so fast that no one could catch her. She was running and soaring up into the air, far towards the horizon. She was the wind. She could take flight. Human prisoners were ordered to lug the escapees out to the posts. Tommy was one of those who was forced to pull at the struggling prisoners. He looked up at Adrian with fear in his eyes as he helped tie the struggling prisoners to the post. The sound of them whimpering toward Adrian's insides. "I'll fly away, oh Lord, I'll fly away." "No, please don't," someone on the post shouted. There was no one to help. Everyone knew it. He knew it. The forced human guards had to cover their mouths. This only made the force shout more, even as their mouths were gagged. "One great morning, when this world is over, I'll fly away. Away, away, so far away I'll fly, and no one will ever catch me." The prestige prisoner walked out of the barracks and into the yard. It addressed the guards in their language. Adrian couldn't understand, but it seemed that it was pleading with them on the human's behalf. The guards listened to it for a while and then pushed it down and kicked it a few times. It limped away, looking very hurt. Antoine began to cry. Adrian tapped him on the stomach to tell him to stop. The air was charged with static that pricked the skin. Adrian had no idea what was going to happen next. Each guard stooped into the corner to pick up something. They re-entered the circle and stood about 6 feet away from the post. Adrian squinted her eyes tight to make out the objects in their hands. They were leather whips. The whites of Kim's eyes glistened as the guard ripped off his rags, then the clothes of the next guy next to him, and then the next, and then the next. Adrian began to sing. "My home world, 'tis of thee." The rest of the prisoners joined in the singing and shaking voices. "Sweet land of liberty." The first slash sent red rippling. The splatter of it stained the ground. A scream, even though the cloth tied around their mouths pierced the ears. Adrian sang louder to cover the echo. "Of thee I sing." The second lash, "Land where my fathers died." The third, "Land of the Terrans' pride." The fourth, "From every mountainside." Lash after lash after lash after lash. "Let freedom ring."